Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Quick backstory. I've been name dropping this report a few times in the last couple months since it came out. The Kremlin's occupation playbook, Coerced Russification and ethnic cleansing in occupied Ukraine. I think it's a great piece of work, and I wanted it to get more attention. And then some gnome at AEI contacted Guy Denton, my gnome, and said, hey, why don't you have the author of the report on the Remnant if you think it's so good? And I like to not encourage my research assistants from thinking they have good ideas, but this was a good idea. And so we've invited Karolina Hird, who's the Russia team deputy lead at the Institute for Study of War, to come on. I should clarify, I actually just learned the actual status of this moments ago. I always thought of ISW as sort of affiliated or associated, or certainly, I think it is literally adjacent in a geographic space to AEI, where I hang my hat. But it is not. It's an independent entity. It's just that we share Fred Kagan, who listeners remember is so sharp you need a tourniquet every time you shake his hand. And so beyond that, that's all. And ISW does like some of the best open source stuff. But why am I explaining it to you? I can have Karolina explain it to you. So Karolina, welcome to the Remnant.
Thank you so much for having me.
So why don't you just sort of explain what ISW's just general approach is before we get into the meat of the report stuff? Like what does it do? What would you say you do here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think most people will know ISW over the past couple years from kind of our day-to-day reporting on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. So we use exclusively open source methodology. So that's basically, for example, social media sources, local media, leveraging commercial satellite imagery, different kind of NASA data, that sort of thing. Everything that anyone could really hypothetically find on the internet. And we will pull that together and create a very synthetic but granular overview of what's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. Our maps are formed with that same methodology, as well as the written text of the daily campaign assessments. Aside from the daily battlefield dynamics that we go into, we look at a range of other stuff under that same open source methodology. So we look at everything from internal Kremlin politics to Russian defense industrial base efforts, force generation, occupation, etc. So the occupation aspect is what I have been focusing on since I've been at ISW for the last over 2 years now. So using that same open source methodology, leveraging local news, Russian language text, etc., to build out a picture of what's happening in the regions of Ukraine that Russia is currently occupying.
It's worth pointing out, I mean, I've known some people who didn't only work with open source, shall we say, right? Like actual Intel people. And it's always kind of surprising how much people on the actual Intel side also just use, I don't want to say just use open source, but like, I think a lot of laymen think that, just using open source is like somehow amateur hour, when in reality, a lot of what actual intelligence analysts do is open source as well, right?
Absolutely. I think that the war in Ukraine has really turned the tide on this a little bit, because there's so much out there in the open source, and there's so much phenomenal analysis that one can do just from looking at drone footage on Twitter, or looking at different geolocated combat footage excerpts, that sort of thing. And I think we know that a lot of our products are used as kind of supplements for the IC. And I think it really goes to show how valuable and important kind of using open source methodology is, not just as kind of a supplement, but also just as a kind of co-equal product in the overall IC war analysis space.
Yeah, I mean, this is a bad sort of analogy, well, not a great analogy, but an illustration of the idea. Is just like, you could have a spy on the ground, that would be closed source, or you could have the pings from 1,000 Russian phones in a certain location. The information that the spy on the ground might give you is that there are 1,000 Russians there, but so would the pings from 1,000 phones, right? I mean, it's like, it's a leveraging thing about where you would deploy closed source, resources at a time when, the availability of stuff in the open domain is like it's never been before. Like 100 years ago, you'd need a spy, right? Because there was no like, oh my gosh, he opened an envelope, right? There's no electronic signal for that, but it's different now.
Right. And I think the battlefield is so transparent these days, which obviously has different impacts on the actual fighting on the ground, but just from an observational standpoint, it's so, everything is so available. And I think that leveraging that availability can bring a lot of really unique perspectives to the conversation that a lot of times the classification systems that exist in the IC can kind of, I guess, obfuscate some of those perspectives.
Okay, so if you had written a book, the general rule in here is the first question I ask is, "What's your book about?" But you didn't. You wrote a report, so I think it's an exclusion to the rule. But what's your report about? Like, explain it. Like, you've been working on this thing clearly for a while. You're deep in it. So, what are the top lines? Why'd you write it? What are the takeaways, etc.?
Yeah. So the report that I wrote for ISW focuses on a couple things. First and foremost, it's looking at why Russia is occupying Ukraine the way that it is. And in order to understand why and how that's happening in the time period between 2022 and 2024, it's really important to deep dive into how Russia occupied Crimea in 2014, because that was essentially their first experiment with occupying Ukraine. And a lot of the lessons they learned have been brought to fruition at a kind of larger and more expedited scale since 2022. So essentially just looking into how Russia is occupying Ukraine and why it's employing the different tools that it is employing, using some grounding in historical analysis from the Crimea example, and then very carefully looking at pretty much everything I've observed over the last 2 years of how the occupation administrations in Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk oblasts are basically trying to forcibly integrate Ukrainian civilians, etc., into the Russian sphere of influence. And a really big part of this, too, is the overall deportation campaign, which is something that I started seeing in July of 2022. The deportation and forced adoption issue, which is very much a supplementary tool to this overall project to basically absorb Ukraine into Russia in such a way that it looks inseparable to both Kiev and Kiev supporters.
So why don't we take 2 seconds and explain what the deportation and forced adoption issue is? Like, what are we actually talking about that in scope, numbers, etc.?
So by the Russians' own admission, and this is a little bit difficult to verify, but by the Russians' own admission, they have quote unquote relocated, but really under international legal norms, deported 5 million or so, 4.8, so close to 5 million Ukrainians since 2022. And the Ukrainian government has actually been able to confirm the identities of 20,000. So that's a pretty big discrepancy, but it's really difficult to confirm the identities of all the people who've been deported because, unfortunately, quite frequently, these deportation schemes target, for example, orphans who don't have good documentation or guardians to kind of speak up for them or confirm their identities. So important to kind of situate the numbers in a wider context. But the Russians' own admission is 4.8 million. And we've been seeing...
And that could be overblown, though, right? I mean, that
could be...
We don't know for sure.
That could be overblown. It's also unclear. We do know that on some occasions, Ukrainians will return to Ukraine after being deported to Russia. That's obviously a complicated process, but the exact statistics are very complicated. I know that saying the range between 20,000 and 4.8 million is like a huge range, but I would say probably closer to the 4.8 million than the 20,000, right. But hard to directly confirm. But there are various schemes through which Russians are deporting Ukrainians. And part of this is to forcibly absorb Ukrainians into Russia and eradicate their identity, which is a component of this. But it's also meant to kind of drive a demographic transition in occupied Ukraine. So we've seen deportation schemes through, for example, children being taken out of orphanages or taken from their homes, etc., and taken to, for example, camps, children's camps in Russia, where they're taught Russian ideals and Russian history, and basically just in a lot of ways, it's brainwashing, right? Eradication of Ukrainian identity. And we've seen so many reports that these children are severely traumatized from being taken from their home and told that their language, their families, et cetera, are quote unquote Nazis, or, any variety of narratives that the Kremlin pushes about Ukrainians. So there's the deportation schemes that target children. We know that adults are also targeted by these deportation schemes. Sometimes they accompany the children, for example, so that it's like deportation of whole families. So there's several methods in which Russians are basically deporting Ukrainians, and specifically Ukrainian children. But in tandem, they're repopulating occupied areas of Ukraine with Russians to very much change the demographic makeup of occupied Ukraine. They did this very intensely in Crimea between 2014 and kind of 2018. They brought over 1 million Russians by Russian estimates, Ukrainian estimates, Russian open source data, et cetera, to Crimea and basically changed the population makeup of Crimea. And we've seen this since the beginning of the war in Ukraine as well. So I think it's useful to think about the deportation issue as part of this dichotomy of deporting Ukrainians to Russia and then repopulating occupied Ukraine with Russians.
So I have many follow-up questions. First of all, I think it's kind of worth pointing out that if you think this forced deportation thing is bad, right? Let's use a normative word there. If you think it's evil, wrong, a crime, the fact that the Russians are the ones bragging about the bigger number is a confession against interest, right? Or admission against interest, because it's like the bank robber saying, I didn't steal $5 million. I sold $50 million, right? It's just worth like keeping that in mind when you talk about this discrepancy between 20,000 and 4.8 million. The damning number comes from the Russians, not from the Ukrainians. But so in terms of follow-up question, do we know, like, I would assume that they're just that these expatriated, I guess that's the wrong word, but these absconded with Ukrainians just don't have the run of the country now, right? I mean, are they confined? Are they monitored? Are they imprisoned? I mean, do we have a sense of, you would not, given the state of paranoia of the Russian regime, you would not want anything close to 4.8 million potential fifth columnists just running free inside of Mother Russia. So, like, what do we know about where they are and how they're actually being treated and monitored and all that kind of thing?
Yeah. So I think you point out a huge aspect of this, which is kind of that social control or like coercion factor. It's oddly a lot. I have a lot less clear of a picture of what happens to adults when they are deported to Russia. But we know that I forget the exact statistics, but there are statistics on Ukrainian adults who have been deported to Russia and are being kept in like detention centers, for example. So they're not just kind of walking around. So that's a little bit more opaque to me. What's startlingly clear to me is what happens to children when they are deported to Russia, because the Russians very much self-admit on this all the time. It makes my job sadly a lot easier when it's like coming to the tracking of kids. So children are, when they're first removed to Russia, they're kept in children's camps. That could be anything from, for example, like a medical, psychological, psychiatric rehabilitation camp to something that resembles, at least on the outset, a summer camp, right? So recreation, outside time, that sort of thing. But they're very much kind of kept away from wider society. And there's been some really good reporting by Russian opposition outlets such as Medusa on basically like the psychological impacts this has on the kids, because Kremlin authorities appear to have kind of issued a directive and kind of guidelines on how to treat these children. And Russian adults who are in charge of, I guess, watching these children are really worried about them acting out or kind of rebelling against their Russian keepers. So there's very much an awareness of this on the Russian side. But then there's children kind of kept in children's homes and then adopted out into Russian families. The Russian commissioner on children's rights herself has adopted a Ukrainian teenager. And the way that she talks about him provides a really interesting framework of understanding of how these adoption processes go about. She's talked about how when she first came to him, or when he first came to her, she was really upset and like didn't want to speak Russian, didn't want to be around Russians. But then after she and her husband essentially brainwashed him, he became a lot more amenable to kind of the Russian side of things and was running around calling Ukrainians Nazis, etc. So a lot of this has to do with kind of the deportation in and of itself is inherently isolating, but they continue to keep these kids very isolated so that they can kind of instill these pro-Russian ideals on them, eradicate their Ukrainian identity, and then basically kind of introduce them into Russian society as very much like controlled kind of case studies. So it's very, very nefarious. And I think we've kind of quietly accepted that this is happening because the Russians have been very, very sadly very good at kind of cloaking this in a humanitarian veneer, I suppose, where they say that, they're saving these kids, they're removing them from a war zone. And I think they've drank their own Kool-Aid in a lot of ways so that I think the Russians believe that they're doing the right thing and that they're saving these kids, they're saving these Ukrainians. But because it's kind of cloaked in this, it becomes a very kind of almost radioactive discussion to have.
Yeah, I want to come back to that in a second, but it just reminds me, I've been meaning to ask somebody about this. I've heard different explanations, but for a lot of Americans, when they hear Putin call Zelensky a Nazi or Ukrainians Nazis and all this kind of stuff, my understanding is that in the West, well, I think it's true. In the West, we associate Nazism with genocidal anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. And that's like, we associate it with invading Poland and whatnot, but like the thing that stands out is the Holocaust part of it, right? And that's not the way. So do you have a good sense of like, or explanation for what the Russians mean by Nazis? It just means potential invaders? Like, does it have a different connotation in Russian rhetoric when they say that, all our enemies are Nazis and fascists?
I think it's a very convenient Kremlin narrative, right? The Kremlin is very good at invoking kind of anachronistic historical concepts to basically further its own information operations. So it's very much always cloaked for example, the Maidan revolution of dignity, etc., in this Nazi rhetoric to really try to make it seem illegitimate. There's no connections there. It's simply rhetorical and kind of a narrative framing. But that's very much the way that the Kremlin kind of conceptualizes or kind of frames Ukraine as, the Kiev Nazi regime, etc., because that has very strong emotional pull for the domestic constituency and then also kind of in the West, right? They know their audiences. They know the emotional solicitation this gets when you're invoking, for example, the Great Patriotic War and the concepts associated with that. So it's very much a rhetorical and like narrative framing. And it's very much lost a lot of its strength, I guess, at this point, because the Russians use it so flippantly that it doesn't even make sense anymore. But the overall kind of strategic objectives in Ukraine of denazification and demilitarization are meant to kind of invoke this historical narrative to elicit a feeling from the domestic audience, international audience, etc.
Right. No, I get that. I mean, Putin basically made the state ideology kind of a World War II cult, starting in early 2000s. I get that. My only point is like when they talk about denazification, right? It can't immediately mean get rid of the Jewish president of Ukraine, right? It's got to mean get rid of the threat. Is sort of like the only way to make it explain on its own, make it make any sense on its own terms, is that in Russian memory, Nazis were bad people. But like they also invaded our country and killed 20 million of us. And so external enemies are called Nazis. At least that's the only explanation I can think of for like why it wouldn't. Then again, I don't know. I take that back, given how many people are calling Israelis Nazis, and we have similar problems there. Okay, so you said earlier that 2014 was, and this is the thing that I'm sort of fascinated with, and I think I went around the horn with Fred about this a little bit. You said 2014 was the first experiment with this Russification thing, and I get it in the sense that I don't disagree in the sense that this was the first implementation of a policy that we're seeing right now, right? But if you go to the conceptual level, Russia has played these kinds of games with population transfers, holding certain populations literally hostage. Russification as a strategy goes way back into Tsarist Russia and all of that. And I've been kind of on this kick lately about the Kennan sort of Soviet interests did not verge that much from Russian interests kind of argument. It seems to me that the ability for Putin to merge both Tsarist ideology or imperial ideology and Soviet ideology in a way that is totally consistent in his head suggests to me that really it's the nature of the Russian nation that is expressing itself in different ways in different contexts over time, but there's a real continuity there, right? I mean, and so I'm just sort of wondering, how far back do you see the antecedents for this?
I mean, you're definitely right. 2014 is not the first time this has happened. I think it's kind of the first kind of what I call the case study when it comes to Ukraine, right?
Right.
Occupying a part of Ukraine. But
modern independent Ukraine, which goes back to the early 90s anyway, right? So it's like a discrete thing.
Exactly. But then, right. I mean, you go a little further back and a lot of the same principles were applied in 2008 with the invasion of Georgia. Go further back, the kind of manipulations in Transnistria in the 90s. And then, of course, the tried and true Soviet strategy of moving populations around within the Soviet Union's claimed borders, right? There were the Stalinist deportations, etc. I personally do not have the historical background to kind of go much further back than that, but I think it's absolutely kind of there is a historical continuity in the way that we've been observing things, and that's what's always kind of startling to me is that 2022 occupation and onward is not new. The 2014 occupation was not new. The 2008 invasion of Georgia was not new. We've seen the condition setting and the templating for this over and over and over again, but still have not kind of figured out as kind of an international community or Ukraine's partners, whatever, how to talk about it or address it or remedy it. And I'm not saying that there's a clean and cut argument to this, but you'd think that the rest of the world would have kind of learned, but we just don't appear to have learned, right? Think about the way that the international community talks about Crimea and thinks about Crimea and the parts of Donbass that have been occupied since 2014.
Yes, I find it particularly vexatious in the sense that we've heard a lot about, and I'm not making this into special pleading for Israel, but we've heard a lot about the evils of settler colonialism lately and how settler colonial powers deserve basically whatever they got coming, and that all forms of resistance to settler colonialism is justified and yada, yada, yada. And we don't need to rehearse all that. Just as a statement of objective fact in history, Russia under the Tsars, Russia under the communists, Russia under Putin is a settler colonial power. And that's one of the things I think is so important about your report is it's literally what Israel is consistently accused of, sometimes with some merit, and about some settler, outposts and whatnot. But sort of at a micro level, Russia is doing on a grand scale. It's changing the facts on the ground, moving hundreds of thousands or millions of Russians into seized territory and extirpating hundreds of thousands or millions of Ukrainians and tens of thousands of children, and turning them into Russians under essentially forced conversions. And if Russia were Muslim, in Ukraine were Presbyterian, and they were converting them all into the state religion of Islam, everyone would recognize I would like to think everyone would recognize how heinous this is. But since the state ideology of Russia is the glory of Russia, converting these children to the state ideology doesn't ping the same way psychologically. But and I can say the same thing about China with Tibet and the Uyghurs and Hong Kong. I mean, this is real settler colonialism at scale. And if people truly believe that settler colonialism is bad, which I think is a perfectly defensible position, it's a little historically naive once you start going back, in time, because the history of the humanities, the history of settler colonialism to one extent or another. But if we think this is one of these old practices that needs to stop, not being more outraged at what Russia is doing kind of calls the bluff on a lot of people who are spending a lot of time talking about this.
Yeah, I mean, I can't necessarily talk to the outside of Russia examples here, but I think that this really goes back to, in essence, this goes back to kind of the Kremlin concept of like reflexive control more broadly, right? And that the Kremlin is very good at, and I'm using the Kremlin as kind of like a stand-in for Russia, right? The
Sure.
Kremlin is good at signaling to external audiences and getting external audiences to do what the Kremlin wants. And a lot of this has been kind of wrapping up the war in Ukraine in all of these different narratives. And I think that the narratives track very closely onto the humanitarian side of things and make people really uncomfortable about talking about them. And that is one of the major components of Russia's occupation project in Ukraine. Even Ukrainians think and feel differently about the way that kind of the territories that, so basically Donetsk, Luhansk, the areas that have been occupied since 2014, and then Crimea should be treated by Kiev in the case of their reintegration. So the way that the Kremlin has shrouded its occupation project and framed it and kind of advertised it is very intentional, and it's intentionally complicated the way that the world kind of looks at it. And I think that it's kind of tamped down some of the outrage because we have all these Kremlin officials running around saying, we're rescuing these kids. We're saving them from a war zone. This is necessary. But then that preempts the conversation of, well, why are they living in a war zone in the first place? Well, it's because you illegally invaded Ukraine and subjected its people to occupation. So it's all kind of wrapped up in ideological narratives and kind of reflexive control techniques, which makes it a very kind of, I think I once said it was a radioactive issue, and I kind of stand by that because it's difficult for, I think, especially like the US to kind of properly engage with concepts about genocide and ethnic cleansing, et cetera, because the Russians have, done such an interesting job cloaking it and kind of covering it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, there's an analogy the way Americans and Canadians threw Native American kids into orphanages and tried to completely deracinate them from their backgrounds and their traditions and their culture and their religion and make them into good Christians, right? And so, like, the Russian narrative that they're telling themselves is they're turning these people that they think are good, are actually confused Russians, right? That's Putin's official position, is that the Ukrainians are just sort of, they're, what do they call them? Little Russians, like they're just, they think they're a country, but they're not, right? And it seems to me like, let me ask it this way. Like, I don't think they feel that way about Georgians, and they certainly don't feel that way about Chechens. Do you see much evidence that because one of I want to get this idea. So I have this big thing about Russia. It's not strictly speaking nationalist in the normal sense because it doesn't have that kind of ethno-nationalism that a lot of nationalist countries do. It is imperialist, and it's self-consumption. It's a little like the French. There's a lot like the French in the 19th century where their imperialism was around Frenchness and the French language. And so, like, kids in Algeria at French schools would go to school every morning and say, our forefathers are Gauls, because they were being taught to be French despite their ethnic or genetic, background. And Russia sort of operates the same way. So they think where everybody speaks Russian, they're Russians in effect, or at least they're part of their zone of control and that kind of thing. But I'm kind of curious, do we have examples or know of, is there evidence that notions of Russian ethnicity are playing a bigger role with the Ukrainian population because of this theory that Putin has that Ukrainians are not, in fact, a different people at all?
So I think the point here that you made is a good one, that kind of language is a through line that defines a lot of what's going on in Ukraine and what's been going on kind of in the post-Soviet space more broadly. But I think that Russia has defined its relationships with the post-Soviet space on very kind of vague and intentionally nebulous terms that don't necessarily account for ethnicity or even language. Language is an important through line, but Russia has defined compatriots abroad. This is an actual term in Russian foreign policy, Russian strategy, etc. Russian compatriots abroad as anyone who feels even like peripherally connected spiritually to Russia. So they've taken a lot of the like concrete grounding factors that kind of an anthropologist would use to define a nation or a community, etc. And they've removed those from the equation and created these very nebulous definitions of what it means to be Russian, and then use that to claim rights, special rights to sovereign people and sovereign territory. We're seeing kind of like even the inklings of this. I mean, Georgia's a good example with the breakaway republics. Transnistria is a really good and scary example of this, with the Transnistrian deputies asking the Kremlin for защита, which is like defense or protection, which will allow...
Why don't you explain for just 2 seconds for people who are not granularly following this? Where is Transnistria? What's its deal? And why is it scary?
Yeah, I'm getting into the weeds here, and I apologize.
No, we like weeds. This is a weedy podcast.
Yes.
That's fine. And just sometimes you have to tell people where north and south is when you're deep in the weeds.
Absolutely. And I think most people, have trouble pointing out Moldova on a map, much less Transnistria. So Transnistria is a small breakaway pro-Russian region on the kind of the east coast of not coast, but eastern border of Moldova that borders Ukraine. It has been, it's a fascinating place, very much more of like a kind of pro-Russian criminal enterprise than like a full proxy state. But the Transnistrian Congress of Deputies appealed to the Kremlin a couple weeks ago for защита, which it's a kind of broad term that means like defense or protection. And we're starting to see kind of the almost like what you're seeing in Ukraine before 2014, when, there's Russian speakers in Transnistria that need defense from the genocidal Moldovan regime. There's Russian passport holders in Transnistria that need protection from Moldova, et cetera. All of this kind of trying to blow up Moldova's EU bid, et cetera. But it kind of goes to the point that I'm making of like, the Kremlin's definition of Russian-ness is so broad that they can really fit anyone they want into that, regardless of religion, ethnicity, language, history, cultural affiliations, etc.
Yeah, no, it's a great hack, right? Because like Hitler had to like rely on, because he was a biological racist and had these notions of Aryan lineage. It's like he had to look for the Sudeten Germans, right? But they had to be Germans, and he didn't want any Slavs necessarily, and I know he turned a whole bunch of Poles into quasi-Germans essentially, but I think they look for blonde ones. But my point is like the Russians, they keep it loose and just basically say anybody who speaks our language or wants our or digs us, they are our sphere of control and we're responsible for them. And it gives them, they don't have to seize every opportunity, but it gives them a lot of options, right? A lot of optionality on that. So I should ask you before we get to like, how do you fix the specific Russification stuff and all that? Because that's sort of begging a certain question, which is, will Ukraine actually win? Why don't we take a time out on the report stuff for a second? How's the actual war going? Like, are you and your colleagues despairing a little bit? I mean, you guys are all very professional, but you're not umpires, right? In the sense that you're not providing the same sort of granular services that would aid and abet Russia's effort, right? You see good guys and bad guys in this, and if I'm wrong about that, correct me. But it doesn't feel like the war is going the way some of us would hope. I don't think it's lost, but winning it seems farther away. What's your assessment of it?
Yeah, so we're in a tough spot right now. And we're in a tough spot largely because of, at this point, US aid, right? And the supplemental.
Or the lack of it.
I mean, yes, the supplemental being tied up and those political debates being very much kind of inhibiting Ukraine's ability to receive the aid it needs from the US. What we're seeing right now is Russia trying to exploit a very specific time window on the battlefield that comes from its understanding of political processes in the West, specifically in the US with the aid packages, and then some battlefield realities kind of led by, for example, the weather conditions, right? We're coming out of the winter, the ground is thawing, the mud season makes it really difficult for like tracked vehicles to move around. So Russia's very much racing against this quickly collapsing time window and trying to basically push everywhere along the line all at once to force Ukraine to commit scarce manpower, materiel, use up its already very, very scarce artillery ammunition, that sort of thing, have to make very difficult calculations about where to commit scarce air defense assets, etc. So right now, it doesn't look particularly great. But the way it looks right now in that kind of like microcosm or like snapshot of the front line shouldn't really be taken as reflective of what will happen once EU arsenals start hitting, or EU aid starts hitting Ukraine's arsenals. If the US aid package comes about, etc. Ukraine is also doing some stuff on its own mobilization front. So they've lowered the mobilization age by 2 years to expand and make that mobilization pool more sustainable. So things are changing, and they're changing in advance of Ukraine anticipating the ongoing or upcoming Russian spring-summer offensive that they've promised or that's been forecasted. So things, again, kind of the KT is that things don't look great now, but that shouldn't be taken as this is the end all be all of what it's going to look like for the rest of 2024. And I think it's really important to not just kind of envision 2024 as the year of Ukraine sitting back, receiving Russian offensives, and not pushing forward at all. And basically just letting Russia keep the initiative throughout the entire year, because that will be very, very costly for Ukraine in the scheme of things.
You speak Russian, right? So you follow Russian media and social media. I think it's very hard for people in the West to appreciate what a hothouse environment Russian media is and how impervious it is to outside facts and all that. At the same time, the terrorist attack at the concert hall, 10 days ago or something like that, do you get any sense that like Ukraine was behind it? Is a widely subscribed to view among normal Russians? Is there a way to know that? I mean, it's not like you can poll reliably on that kind of thing, and it's not like a lot of people are going to post their true feelings on their Telegram accounts. But at the same time, I find it very hard to believe that message is succeeding, but they're definitely trying.
It's a good point, and I don't have an exact feeling on how your average Russian thinks about this, but even the Kremlin's messaging has been super dissonant, because on one hand, Putin, Patrushev, all of these kind of high-ranking Kremlin figures have been running around saying it's Ukraine. But then on the other hand, the actual like tangible physical response to this has been crackdowns against migrant communities, kind of counterterrorism raids in the Caucasus, etc., that very much look like the Kremlin is actually trying to address the potential threat of ISK recruitment, etc., in Russia itself, and realizing that migrant communities are particularly vulnerable because of the way that the Kremlin has disenfranchised them, etc. So the Kremlin messaging on this is weird, and it's not agreeing, right? Because officials are saying one thing, law enforcement is doing another thing that doesn't seem to, look like they're going after Ukraine. So just from a basic messaging standpoint, it's kind of, the Kremlin line is one thing, the Kremlin response is another. And it's interesting. And I don't have a very good sense of kind of how your average Russian is kind of picking up on that divergence, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, so like when you monitor, just more generally, forget the ISIS-K part, like just when you monitor Russian media, Russian social media, how free do you think actual Russians feel about expressing their views on what's going on? Because it's always kind of shocking to me. I mean, like I'm a pretty devoted listener to the Telegraph's Ukraine, the latest podcast, and whenever they're reading from what the Russian military bloggers are saying about this war is a disaster, Putin screwed it up. They usually don't say Putin screwed it up, but like they'll say,
Shoigu.
The military screwed it up, right? And it sounds like pretty harsh stuff for a country that is supposed to be this quasi-totalitarian police state. And so the harshness has to be certain kind of criticism has to be allowed to be expressed, but more broadly, because it serves Putin's aims or whatever. But like, what visibility do you guys actually have about what the state of Russian morale is, Russian attitudes about the war? Is it all gleaned from the small protests or people throwing flowers in Navalny's grave, or is there more robust data to be found?
We've looked at a lot of different sociological polling from within Russia. There's some good, I'm forgetting the names, but some good organizations that do kind of independent polling. And we've looked at different polls, different kind of surveys of the general attitude in society. And for the most part, it's this kind of general apathy, right? The social situation in Russia is, it's not great, but Russia has kind of overcome a lot of the sanctions, a lot of the shocks that they were feeling the first year of the war. 2 years on, it feels a little more minimized. So there's this general apathy within Russian society of, this is our life now, we're just going to get on with it. And very much like the protests and experience of the war have been siloed. And the Kremlin is very good at kind of isolating communities from kind of talking and like spreading discontent. So generally, we're seeing that Russian society has just kind of accepted this as the outcome. They generally want Russia to win in Ukraine, but they're not, up in arms about it. And, discontent or protest movements are very much on the periphery of society by design. Putin kind of experienced the power of, for example, the mothers or families of soldiers movements. And he's been very much trying to kind of prevent that from becoming a thing as much in this war. And the mill bloggers, there's actually a lot of censorship and that's been going on in the mill blogger community. So when you talk about mill bloggers criticizing the military, they're criticizing the MOD, which Putin is trying to scapegoat, right? He wants the blame to fall on the Minister of Defense Shoigu, Chief of the General Staff Gerasimov, and just kind of the institution that is the MOD. The mill bloggers or the commentators that were criticizing the Kremlin and Putin are in prison, dead, unaccounted for, or the Kremlin has kind of bought them off and given them state awards, etc., to kind of co-opt them and bring them closer into the Kremlin sphere of influence. So even when we're talking about the critical mill blogger community, there's a lot more censorship and control there than you would kind of see because of how critical they are, but that criticism is curated and specifically directed.
So just another thing on the nuts and bolts stuff. At the beginning of the war, it was fun. People like you and others could pick up Russians saying the dumbest friggin' things on their phones, not thinking that anyone else would be paying attention and all that. How much has Russia imposed discipline on its own troops for that kind of thing? Is your job harder now to find this stuff? And what have they actually done to make it harder?
Yeah, so just because we do look quite heavily at the mill bloggers, and so many of our like Russian military sources have their channels have been taken down, they've been thrown in prison, silenced, all of this sort of stuff. It actually is a little bit more difficult. Our pool of sources has shrunk since the start of the war.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there's been more, especially after kind of personal electronic use was linked to Ukrainian strikes on Russian concentration areas. Their general desire to maintain good OPSEC, operational security, has increased. So that's kind of limited some of what we've seen. Though, we're still getting enough that we can form assessments, but the media environment and the information space has changed a lot since even last year, since the beginning of last year. So we're just trying to kind of figure out methodologically how to navigate those shifts in the broader information space.
So with the report, let's say Ukraine wins, including taking back Crimea or not. We can talk about, like I understand, I want Ukraine to have Crimea back, but I think everyone, even if they're wrong, the fact that so many people are wrong about how that's a different thing makes it more difficult, right? How the hell do you unwind this, right? I mean, you've got people buying condos, people buying property, you got kids who have been brainwashed. How do you change those facts on the ground anytime soon?
That is the ultimate question, something that I've been reckoning with a lot while I was writing and then after writing this report. And frankly, I don't have an answer right now. I think that Ukraine will have to look, well, I will say that the Ukrainian government has a lot of contingency plans. The Ukrainian Ministry of Reintegration, this is their kind of entire project, right? How do we get our people back? How do we reintegrate them into Ukrainian society? How do we work with external partners to repatriate Ukrainian children, get families out of occupied areas, etc.? So the Ukrainian government has a framework, and they've had a framework since 2014 because of the occupation of Crimea and Donbass in 2014. I've been reckoning with this a lot and thinking through kind of like historical examples and kind of what parallels Ukraine could look at when they think about reintegrating territory. Something that Fred and I have talked about, for example, is France kind of reintegrating its territory after like the fall of the Vichy regime, because Ukraine is going to have to reckon with the fact that Ukrainian civilians have kind of taken up positions in occupation administrations and are collaborating with the Russian government, that sort of thing. So thinking through how this was done in the past, how this could be done in Ukraine now. I think especially the repatriation issue is going to be so difficult and heartbreaking by design, right? Because when Russia's removing these children and adopting them into Russian families, that's purposeful so that they can never come back to Ukraine. So there's a lot of Ukrainian organizations that are doing work on the ground to physically bring people back. So whatever lessons they're learning that they can apply on a larger scale will be useful. But as of now, I sadly do not have an answer, because I think it's going to be multifaceted, multi-component, and the way that it's so complicated, again, is the exact purpose of the Russian occupation project in the first place, right?
I don't think I asked this before, but it just occurs to me, like, let's say the number is much closer to 4.8 million than 20,000, right? Just by the laws of large numbers, you would think that a goodly number of Ukrainians would have escaped and made it back, right? But you're saying how you don't have much visibility about what happens to adults. Have anybody come back from these places and said, hey, here's what's going on, here's how we retreated, I got out on a laundry truck, or anything like that? There's no firsthand testimony to sort of give us some sense of what's going on with them?
There is some of that. There have been some interviews done with kids who've been kind of exfiltrated is not the right word, but basically, repatriated, and they've given firsthand accounts of what's happened to them in children's camps, kind of how they were deported, how they were treated, etc. But I think the Ukrainian government has actually managed to mediate some returns of children through the Qataris. So the Qataris are kind of working with Russia and Ukraine to bring kids back. And there's quite a bit of a lockdown on those kids once they get back to Ukraine. I think largely because they're probably very traumatized, and it's difficult. You don't want to be taking a kid who has gone through the worst trauma of their life and then like putting them in front of cameras.
Yeah.
So that's another thing, right? Like developing procedures to keep these children safe once they're being reintegrated into society after suffering substantial trauma. But there
are no adults who've made it out?
I think there definitely are. I can't think of any examples of like interviews. There have been some interviews done with like 16, 17, 18-year-olds who've made it back, and they've had their harrowing experiences living under Russian occupation in Russia, etc. I think it's very difficult for people to like escape on foot back to Ukraine, or kind of cross back from occupied Donetsk Oblast back to Ukrainian controlled territory just because of the front line, etc. But yeah, I think I'm struggling to think of some exact stories, but they do exist. People do manage to get back. Sometimes, they can coordinate their way back because they have family members in Russia who can kind of help them get back. I've heard one-offs of that, but those are very much one-offs and not kind of systematic examples.
Yeah, I mean, forget getting to Ukraine. You think someone can make it to Istanbul, right, or something like that, right? I mean, I get getting to Kyiv from Sevastopol is a hike, particularly if you're in some sort of camp. I'm not asking this because I don't think you're right. I mean, again, like we don't know the exact number. I just think the fact that we're not hearing a lot of stories about this, about grown people who are expatriated for one reason or another, is because bad things either happen to them or is happening to them. Because again, I don't know if you know about this, but like I was raised by a dad who was a passionate, intellectual, anti-communist guy, and he held paper on a lot of this stuff. And he would quote me chapter and verse. I remember asking him when I was a little kid about, it was a big thing when I was a kid about the POW MIAs in Vietnam and whether or not there were still Americans there. My dad went through all the victims of Yalta and all these kinds of things. And he was like, and then of course there was the Greek Civil War where the Soviets took hundreds or thousands of kids and families and expatriated them because they want them as hostages or captive populations or future agents or whatever. And then just an enormous number of them, like with the Stalin transfers and all that, they were just killed. They were just either killed through deprivation or execution. It seems to me like it is not a great sign that we haven't gotten some rogue video testimony from a lot of people saying, we're here, this is what's going on. I'm sure Ukraine has networks of people inside Russia that, are trying to get visibility on a bunch of things. And just the fact that these stories are not surfacing in a way that highlights what's going on is not a great sign about what the reality is for these people who are taken out of since 2014 or since 2022. But maybe I'm wrong. I doubt it.
The fact that we're not hearing stories about people getting out of Russia and how that is a bad sign. And I think part of that could be true in that, there's a lot of social control over people who've been deported to Russia. So we can't really tell what's happening with them. And it's just hard for them to escape and get out. I also think that the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian organizations probably have a pretty big interest in keeping whatever networks they have under wraps because they don't want to expose, the channels through which they are repatriating people,
right?
Especially
sources,
vulnerable
and methods,
people.
all that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I know that, I've spoken to some Ukrainian orgs that are operating on the ground, and they're understandably a little bit cagey about their methods because this is where you really get into kind of human intelligence and human networks and don't want to expose that. And I think that on a wider level, the Ukrainian government is also probably interested in keeping the ways that it's repatriating people quiet. There's also the larger conversation about trauma and re-traumatizing people through kind of having their stories broadcast. I'm sure that they do exit interviews, if you want to call it that, in kind of confidential settings. But there's a lot of human elements to this that I think really complicate the story. And yeah, I think this is one of those things that unfortunately, we're coming up against the bounds of what open source can do because we can see what's being posted on Telegram and what interviews are going out in major news outlets, but it's really difficult to actually see what's going on inside Russia with these people who've been deported and all of that. So very complicated and difficult, which makes the reintegration question even more difficult.
Yeah. No, that's all perfectly legitimate pushback, and I get it. At the same time, like, there's a British newspaper somewhere that is willing to pay some Ukrainian guy who made it back to talk about the arduous stuff, and they're not finding that person. That's my point. It's like we would hear more, right? I mean, like the northern press heard from slaves who made it, to freedom, and they ran their stories and that kind of stuff. And maybe that's not the best analogy, but you get the point. Is like during the Cold War, people who made it out of under the Berlin Wall, or over the Berlin Wall, they some of them had stories to tell. Some of them didn't want to tell their stories. The fact, again, I take all your points. My only thing is that for all of the discipline Ukrainians are trying to apply to this to keep their sources and methods safe and all that kind of stuff, it has to be a fairly small number making it out to make that task possible, to make that population manageable. And I just don't think that's a great sign. But I mean, I just think it would be good. And if they do have these people, it would be good for those stories to get out, because people are really losing sight of the fact that Russians really are, they're not just bad guys because people like Ukraine. What they're doing and how they're doing it defies the laws of war and is abhorrent. And it's in our interest for them to lose. So like the propaganda war, we could be doing a lot better on, I think.
Absolutely. I think the closing point that I make a lot when I'm talking about my report, my work, is that, we are thinking about this war as lines on a map. What side is blue? What side is red? How many square meters did red gain in one day? And operational analysis by default very much makes people operational inputs and takes their humanness out of it in a lot of ways. But when we're talking about this war, we are talking about people and human people who are living under Russian occupation. And I think coming up with a better way as Ukraine's partners to combine our understanding of the war holistically as battlefield outcomes and also deeply, deeply human outcomes, right? All of the conversations we're having about aid, yes, it's about the battlefield, but in my opinion, it's more importantly what's happening behind the front line. Like, why does it matter that Ukraine is getting its territory back? Well, territory is important. It has strategic implications, but it's people. Putin has always endeavored to control Ukrainian people, not necessarily Ukrainian land. It's about people. And I think just really marrying the two discussions, right? And I think that in the West, these two camps are quite separated, right? There's the military analysts and then the people looking at more of the human rights stuff. And I think, there's no clear-cut answer to this, but bringing those two things in together to kind of really make people understand the cost and the implications of this beyond just battlefield gains, etc.
Okay. Karolina Hird, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for your good work. Obviously, we'll put the report in the show notes and links to ISW and all of that. And thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Okay, so Karolina Hird has left the studio. If things sounded a little sort of weird and strained, which maybe we'll fix in editing at the end, it's because her battery completely died on her towards the end. And there's a long lacuna, delta, hiatus between my long-winded and rambling question about missing Ukrainian adults and her answer. But we got her back, and I really do recommend the report. I will probably keep revisiting this stuff because I think it's just, I was a very strong supporter of Ukraine from the outset, right? And I still yet to find a very compelling argument about why we should throw Ukraine under the bus. And I mean that it's sort of, I haven't found a really good, persuasive, realist case. I found plenty of pieces that point out things of serious concern that policymakers should be aware of. Don't get me wrong. This is not a perfect situation by any stretch of the imagination, and how America proceeds is complicated. I don't dispute that at all. But let me put it this way. The moral case is unassailable as far as I'm concerned, and I've found nobody to make a moral case that can justify what Russia did or justify us turning a blind eye to it, at least rhetorically, if not, and I would argue in policy matters. Russia is an evil actor in this context, It is doing evil things every single day as a matter of policy. And it would be antithetical to American interests and our allies' interests, and our allies matter, were Ukraine to fall to Putin. I think I'm as convinced of that as I've been. I keep trying to find interesting steel manning of the other side, and I just don't think there is any. With the, again, with the caveat that like there's some sort of people of the sort of realist school say Russia cares about Ukraine more than we do, and so Russia is going to do what is necessary and is willing to do more and pay a higher price than we are. And I think that's true. But I also think the costs for us are so much lower because we do not border Russia. And at minimum, on a pure realpolitik level, making Russia pay a higher price to do this is in our interest. And Russia deserves to pay a higher price for doing that. And it would be good for the world if Russia paid the highest price, which is to lose this war and maybe quite possibly see Putin's regime overthrown as a result. And people say that's pie-eyed, but history of Russia is the history of disastrous military engagements leading to coups, overthrows, and changes in the regime. I mean, it's happened many times before. I felt this way before October 7th, but listening to people think that all they have to do is say the abracadabra words, settler colonialism, or occupier, or aggressor, and that justifies being pro-Hamas or anti-Hamas, or being profoundly, contemptuously anti-Israel, or making apologies or turning a blind eye to anti-Semitism. I have problems with all those things on the merits, but to use these abracadabra words as if they justify it, as if, well, we're talking about fighting settler colonialists, and settler colonialist oppressors, they deserve everything they got coming to them. And if these people don't feel exactly the same way about Russia, where there is just vastly more evidence that is exactly what Russia is doing and intending to do, absconding with children, erasing a culture, reprogramming people, targeting hospitals, which, look, when Israel attacks hospitals, it's because Hamas is back in a hospital, fighting from a hospital. It's using a hospital as a military asset. Russia just fires on hospitals. They don't care if there are Ukrainian soldiers in them. They don't care if it's a military asset, because it's not a military asset. Russia is doing literally what people are accusing Israel of doing falsely all the time. And to hear the sanctimony and the self-righteousness from the anti-Israel crowd by invoking these principles of resistance and anti-settler colonialism and anti-imperialism as their rationale is infuriating to me. And I just think that this is a point that needs to be pointed out again and again and again, because the logic, the false logic, the permission structure that people get from these magic words vis-a-vis Israel need to be called out, right? I mean, if you're against settler colonialism, I'll argue with you about how well that concept applies to Israel. But if you think that concept applies to Israel 100% or even 50%, and that justifies whatever Israel has got coming to it, but you absolve Russia and China for the same thing when it's so obviously clear that they are more guilty, more egregiously guilty of that crime or that sin than what people allege about Israel, then I'm going to have to say that, your issue really isn't with settler colonialism. Your issue is with this one Jewish country. And that's a structurally anti-Semitic formulation. Anyway, we can talk about this more. We will talk about this more. Thanks again to Karolina Hird. Thank you all for listening. And I'll see you next time.
Nie zobaczysz go następnym razem, bo to jest podcast.